Well, joining me now are Ali Renison, who's Head of Europe and Trade Policy at the Institute of Directors, Neil Dixon, Chief Executive of the NHS Confederation and Co-Chair of the Brexit Health Alliance, and Martin Howe, QC, from Lawyers for Britain. Welcome to all of you for coming on the programme. We've got a lot to rattle through, so let's start rattling. Neil Dixon, over to you first. Can you reassure a potential patient that if there is a no-deal Brexit, or rather, are you reassured that that patient will get the same treatment in a year's time as he would do today?
Well, I think we can be a little more assured than we were yesterday, because it is clear that the government is starting to take this seriously. It's recognised that it's all very well to hope for the best, but you've got to start planning for the worst. And that, in a sense, is what the first step has involved today. And the decision, for example, to ask pharmaceutical companies to plan were 6 months of stockpiling, to ask also that where drugs are perishable or they've got short shelf lives, that they should arrange air freight, because the first problem that is going to face us with a no-deal Brexit is around the borders and passing through those borders in the days and weeks after that decision. So I think it is right. The government is taking some steps. In answer to your question, am I totally reassured? I think the answer is not at this stage, though I don't think there is any reason for patients to panic or get anxious at this moment. I think in time this will be sorted, but the government is starting quite late in the day, and I think doing some of this stuff in the time that we've got will be a challenge.
But briefly, things like insulin, for instance, there were quite a few stories about that. There won't be enough insulin for people who suffer from diabetes. Are you reassured on that front, for instance?
Well, I think that what the government has done is identify every single medicine where we are dependent to some degree or other on imports from Europe, and has looked into the vulnerabilities in each area, is talking to the manufacturers about making sure that there are the right levels of stockpiling. I mean, that is exactly what should have happened and is now happening. So to that extent, I think we can be reassured. But of course, some of the details still needs to be followed up. And I think our members in hospitals, for example, all around the country, emergencies, this is a really challenging and difficult and unprecedented set of circumstances.
Okay. Ali Renison, are you reassured? You represent companies, the Institute of Directors. Has enough been said to you to reassure you?
Well, it is a belated first step. It would have been helpful to have this much earlier on in the game, because I think what it in some ways sends a message, even if indirectly, to a lot of businesses, is that it's being put out this late because no deal looks imminent. And I think if it had been done earlier, that would have been avoided. Having said that, it's certainly a welcome, if belated, first step. And the big question will be what's coming in the next set of tranches, because there's quite a bit missing, whether it was on citizens' rights, enforcement of other related contracts. So all eyes will be on the next tranche, very much so.
But quite a bit missing could also be really quite existential for quite a few businesses, couldn't it?
Yeah, and I think that, there were three things we were looking for from today. One was information about how rules would change, and I think the government did a very good job of that, explaining how trade currently flows with the EU and how it would change once third country rules are applied. Secondly, what steps business should be taking now. And thirdly, what unilateral action it would take to mitigate the impact of no deal. And I think what we are still looking for, there was a lot of information on the pharmaceutical front, but when it comes to particularly the areas that the government can control on imports, we would have liked to have seen around VAT and customs within the constraints of international trade rules, what more mitigating action the government would be taking under a no-deal scenario to reduce the impact.
Martin, now let's turn to you. You've written a long article where you said actually we should embrace no deal because we'd be better off in a no-deal Brexit than under the Chequers proposal. Tell us about oranges.
OK. Well, at the moment, oranges face a 16% tariff when they're imported from outside the European Union. And this is a symptom of the structure of tariffs that has really existed ever since we first joined the common market in 1972. Basically, there are very high tariffs on areas that protect continental farming interests, German manufacturers, the Italian clothing industry. All these are areas of high tariffs. Now, the effect of having a high tariff on, in this case, the example is oranges, is, of course, that we pay above the world price, that is, British consumers pay above the world price for oranges, and if we import competing oranges from Florida or wherever, they have to pay the tariff.
Right.
So one of the things that we can do when we leave is immediately get rid of tariffs on goods where we have no domestic growers or producers.
Okay.
Oranges is an example.
So we might be able to buy cheaper oranges, but what about, exporting to the European Union? And what about credit card transactions, VAT on parcels, pensions not being guaranteed in the way that they are right now? This is pretty big stuff, bigger than oranges, arguably.
Well, oranges, of course, is just one tiny example. Actually, the effect is pretty vast, because if we pursue a sensible tariff policy, we would be able to cut the costs of our imports on goods across the board by a very considerable level. And you're looking at savings in the many billions of pounds a year for British consumers. Now, you asked about exports into the EU. Of course, that's the opposite direction. The European Union would naturally, in fact, it's required by WTO rules to impose the same tariffs on imports from the UK as it does from the rest of the world. But studies have been done on how much that would be, and it's around 5 billion a year, which our exporters pay. It's under half our current net budget contribution, so it's not a big deal.
All right, just one other brief one to you. The Chancellor's prediction were pretty dire today, even worse than his previous predictions. 80 billion extra pounds in borrowing, a stagnant economy for 15 years. Do you dismiss those proclamations?
Well, I'm not an economist, so I don't necessarily want to get into the economic debate. But what I would say is the Treasury has consistently produced a series of studies which have purported to demonstrate it's all a disaster if we leave. This is more of the same pattern. And interestingly, one of the problems was they fed in an assumption in their original studies, which was that we would gratuitously impose huge import tariffs, which we don't need to do.
All right. I'm afraid the clock really is against us. So much more to discuss, no time to do it. Ali Renison, Neil Dixon.